I think the role of a nonprofit is always to advance stuff that is not being advanced in any other way. So, like, what is the most neglected thing holding stuff back? That's what nonprofits should do.
Welcome to the Business for Good podcast, a show where we spotlight companies making money by making the world a better place. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and if you share a passion for using commerce to solve many of the world's most pressing problems, then this is the show for you. Welcome, friends, to episode 42 of the Business for Good podcast. I hope you're all doing well as the economy begins to start up again in what, at least for now, appears to be some relaxation of the shelter-in-place orders. Now, if you're a regular listener of the show, you may recognize the name of this episode's guest since she has been mentioned on at least 2 past episodes. Isha Datar is a co-founder of both Perfect Day and Clara Foods, companies that are respectively growing dairy and egg proteins from microbes and which were the subjects of episodes 21 and 34. Yet Isha is perhaps best known not for her work co-founding for-profit startups seeking to build a more sustainable food system, but really for her role as the executive director of New Harvest, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the field of cellular agriculture, a term, by the way, that Isha coined. Since it was already discussed on past episodes, if you want to hear those stories about the founding of those companies, go back and take a listen to those past conversations with Perfect Day and Clara Foods, or read my book, Clean Meat, in which Isha is a prominent character throughout. One update to her story, though, that you will hear in this interview is that Isha is so mission-driven for her nonprofit organization that she's even transferred her equity in the company she co-founded from her to New Harvest. Already, these companies have valuations in the hundreds of millions, so hopefully one day New Harvest will be the beneficiary of some of those shares. You will hear in this interview what role Isha thinks nonprofits like hers should play in the industry, how many of the people working now at Cell Ag startups have come through New Harvest, whether as former New Harvest board members like Uma Valetti of Memphis Meats, or former New Harvest fellows like Marie Gibbons and Jess Krieger, who've also both gone on to important careers in the field. We also talk in the interview about controversial topics like what to call meat grown from animal cells, when that meat may end up hitting the market, and whether it will be more of an evolution or a revolution in the meat industry. And Isha scores points with me for quoting the late astronomer and hero of mine, Carl Sagan. Really, this episode has got it all. So sit back, be inspired by Isha's impressive working career. I know I certainly was. Isha, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Nice to be here, Paul. Or here in whatever sense that means today.
Yes, because of the pandemic, we are not physically together, but we are virtually together. And it is very nice to be here, especially because your name has come up in a number of past episodes. So regular listeners will hopefully remember your name coming up in the Perfect Day episode when I was very honored to get to try their ice cream before it even ever came out, before they were even selling it online, let alone now in a store in San Francisco. In the Clara Foods episode, when I was in their office as well. So you've been a name on the show, but somebody who I've been hoping to get onto the show for some time. So thank you for making it happen.
For sure. It's great to be here.
Well, it's awesome. So in addition to you being named in the show, Isha, I will say we also share quite a past together because the very first time, as you'll remember, maybe you want to tell the story, but in 2014, the very first time either one of us consumed meat that had been grown from animal cells was together.
Yes, that's true. And if I remember correctly, that was the first time you had eaten meat in a number of decades.
You have a really good memory. That is true. I stopped eating meat in 1993, so that would have been 21 years later. And we were at Modern Meadow. But you tell the story, Isha.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of your other shows, Ryan and Paramount from Perfect Day were there too. And we were tasting what was it called? A steak chip. And that was cultured meat, made entirely of muscle cells, but with this completely different format where it had this mouthfeel and experience of eating a potato chip in many ways. It was crispy and salty and crunchy. And for me, that was such a big step because, we always think of cultured meat in the limited by how we understand meat to be. And that was the first time I really thought deeply about, okay, actually the boundaries of what meat the definition of what meat is has now exploded, and there's so many more options than we thought of before.
Yeah, for sure. And
Mhm.
it was so nice of Andras Forgax, the founder and CEO of Modern Meadow, to offer that for us. And
Yeah.
for those who follow the space, he no longer is producing those steak chips. He's shifted entirely to growing leather rather than growing meat. So he's focusing on the outside of the animal rather than the inside. But
Mhm.
it was so nice of him. But you may remember he showed us videos of like the only other people who had eaten it, and it was like these billionaires. It was like
Yeah.
I mean, I felt I couldn't believe it. It was like that we were in this club back in 2014, and I remember thinking that there were fewer people who had consumed meat grown from animal cells in the world than there were people who have ever left the planet. Like if you think about how
Yeah.
many people have left Earth, it's many hundreds.
Yes.
Whereas at that time, at least, it was a tiny little club. So I was honored to be inducted into that club simultaneously with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking with you, Paul, because you remind me the weight of these things that happen in our lives. Because I think back, and for me, it was just eating a steak chip. But when you give all that context, it's like, wow, we really were at the forefront of something that has become so much more even since.
Oh yeah, I mean, what a dramatic explosion since then. I mean, you talk about an explosion in the concept of meat, and I want to talk about that later for sure. But
Mhm.
since then, I think I would speak for anybody, let alone the two of us. And you fast forward today, 6 years later, and just
Mhm.
the enormity of how much this space has grown. It's
Mhm.
truly incredible. It's just truly incredible. But let's start closer to the beginning for you, Isha, because
Yeah.
people who know you, they know you're the executive director of New Harvest. They know that you're a
Mhm.
co-founder of some of the companies in this space, like Perfect Day and Clara Foods. But how did it
Mhm.
get started for you? Like how did it come to pass that you got interested in this field in the first place, let alone became such a leader in it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I came to this field as a science student. I was doing a cell and molecular biology degree at the University of Alberta in Canada. And it all happened because I would hang out at the greenhouse at my university and I saw a poster on the wall for a meat science class there and thought, oh my gosh, meat science is biology, but it's the type of biology I can talk about with literally anyone on earth because you can talk about meat to absolutely anybody. That you could have a political conversation, a scientific conversation, a culinary conversation, whatever. And I was kind of really looking for that in my science degree experience. And so I took this meat science class, and my professor, Dr. Mirko Betty, my poultry science professor, was the most forward thinking, future oriented professor of my whole education. And he introduced us kind of on the first day to the impact of animal agriculture. And that completely blew me away. I thought of myself as an environmentalist, and I thought I was doing something by biking to school every day when really, um, as I heard person put it, I had a Hummer in the kitchen or, or whatever. So all this time, I was kind of not focused in the places that made the most impact. And I came away from that lesson thinking, oh my gosh, we all have to go vegan tomorrow. Obviously, that's the only hope we have. And very quickly, I realized that wasn't an option, not only because, the messaging around that has been around for thousands of years, but also there are many incredible people working on that today. And I didn't think there was a lot I could add to that conversation to advance that mission. So I was kind of stuck with that. And then a few classes later, the same professor introduced the idea, kind of in passing, that we could grow meat in cells one day, or sorry, grow meat from cells one day. And because I had come from the Faculty of Science and we were learning about tissue engineering and so on, I latched onto that idea and thought this is the most obvious next step for agriculture. Like, this is absolutely where we're going. We're not going to be farming organisms anymore. We're going to be farming cells directly. And, how do I get involved? How do I stand behind this? Where do I sign up? And I was amazed to find out that the idea did, I mean, it had legs, but there were so few people working on it in the world. And I was kind of shocked to find, you Googled back then in vitro meat and New Harvest would come up. And of course, New Harvest was founded by Jason Matheny, who's someone you're also close with, and I believe is also known as Gavrik.
Well, yeah, that's his middle name. But
Yeah.
back in back in the day when we first became friends, he was Gavrik. But now he goes by Jason. But it's hard. It's tough for those of us who know him as Gavrik to think of him as Jason, which sounds much more grown up.
Yeah. Um, anyway, Jason had the New Harvest homepage then. It had been around since 2003. And it was kind of the only place on the internet that had compiled a bunch of articles and things on growing meat from cells. And I emailed him one day and I said, no, actually, I'm getting my story mixed up. So what happened was after I learned about the concept, I wrote this huge term paper on growing meat from cell cultures, digging into all of the literature in kind of the tissue engineering biomedical world, but applying it to food and saying like, look, in these fields, we're doing this with fat, we're doing this with muscle, we can derive these types of cells, grow it on these types of scaffolds, et cetera, et cetera. What if we looked at all of that in the context of growing food, so we don't have to rely on animal agriculture? And that term paper I was very, very proud of. It was probably more I had worked on that more than most things I had worked on in my life up until that point. And I sent it to Jason at New Harvest and said, I wrote this paper in class. I'd love to hear your thoughts. It looks like you compile a lot of literature here. So here's one more resource if you're interested. And he emailed me back and CC'd at least half of the researchers I had cited in my paper. And suddenly there was this peer review process going on in my university email. And I was so taken aback by it because I was just an undergrad student. And to see so much energy for an idea that I thought was really unique and didn't have a community around it yet, to see that there was a community, they really cared about the idea, and also that whatever kind of ivory tower exists in academia seemed to not exist for this field yet. That was awesome to see too, because I was on a kind of level playing field where people were saying, this is an awesome paper. Have you thought about revising this, or look at this citation, or read this other thing? And it was awesome that no one asked me how old I was or what university I was at or anything. It was very cool. And I had to email Jason on the side and say, Jason, I'm like just an undergrad student. He's like, really? I had no idea. You should publish this. There's not very many publications in the field, and it can really add a lot to this concept and moving it forward. And so I did go ahead and publish that a year later. I dug a bit deeper into it. My paper was published 10 years ago as of earlier this year, January of this year. So I can't believe that was that long ago, but it remains a really great kind of starting point for anyone interested in cellular agriculture and cultured meat production in terms of kind of covering the basics. And it was, I guess, my first starting point into not only cultured meat, but the cultured meat community, and kind of identifying what needs were both from the scientific angle, but also from the research community angle.
Sure. Well, I remember when your article came out, I read it because Jason/Gavrik sent it to me when it was published. And I learned from it, and I was like, wow, that's cool that there are articles that are actually being published about this. Like, it wasn't just like a NASA experiment that was,
Right.
looking at how to grow goldfish for astronauts on long distance cosmic tourist trips, but rather it was, not a space technology, but something for right here on Earth, which was, pretty remarkable to me. And as somebody who had been basically watching Jason for a long time on this. We were actually lived together back then, back in like '02 or '03. And at that time, I always just thought of what he was doing as something that was cool, but seemed like decades off. It just seemed like, this is some sci-fi technology that would be awesome and that is on Star Trek, but, it didn't seem likely to occur. And when I read your paper, I remember thinking, well, maybe I'm not right about that. Maybe there is something here that could actually get sparked. And so your
Yeah.
paper provided a spark for me. And now, of course, and quite more than a spark for you, in that 10 years later, you're now a leader in this movement, and have been for a long time. But just to fast forward the story, Isha, so after your paper came out, I know
Mhm.
that Jason was thinking about moving on after running New Harvest for a while. And
Mhm.
then he thought, well, who should be my successor? Well, this former undergrad who published this awesome paper. Is there more to it
Yeah.
than that? Or tell me, is that an accurate telling of the story?
Yeah, so I know that New Harvest was looking for an executive director for a few years, and Jason did a lot of incredible work at New Harvest, but for him, it was always a like evenings and weekends type of gig, and he had a full time job. He had at least one full time job, knowing Jason. So I was always keeping tabs on who is the executive director going to be. And then someone, I can't remember who, and I'm probably going to say the wrong name, but I think it was actually Nick Genovese, who's now, one of the co-founders of Memphis Meats. I think he sent me a message that was like, why don't you apply to this position? And I was like, oh, I don't know anything about running a nonprofit. And he said, you know, just apply. Like you've written this paper, you've done a lot of public speaking on the topic. Like New Harvest needs leadership. And so I did, and as soon as I did, there was no plan B. I was like, this is the only thing I want to do. There's nothing I want to do more than this. And at the time, I had done a master's of biotechnology. I was working full time at GlaxoSmithKline in pharma, a big pharma. I was focused on policy and public affairs. So I worked, my first big task was writing a huge briefing document on all the policies that were affecting the pharma industry for the incoming CEO. So that was an awesome first project. But then after that project was done, I was kind of like, okay, what's my next move here? And I wanted my next move to be cultured meat or bust. And I remember talking to my boss at the pharma company, and they're like, so, we really like you around here. Like, are you going to apply? And I was like, nope. And they're like, what are you going to do instead? And I was like, I'm thinking about this thing. And they're like, what is that? It was so funny. But yeah, what ended up happening is I applied for New Harvest to be executive director at the same time as when I applied to do the first TEDx talk on cultured meat, which was in Toronto. At the time, that TEDx Toronto was, I think, one of the maybe top 5 TEDx's in the world, had a really big audience, super wonderful production value. And I don't know if I've told this story publicly yet, but and I don't think Jason knows this either. But I
Well, you
told
may
the
as well
TEDx
tell him now.
people, now's the time. I told the TEDx people, like, I did this research, and I'm going to become the executive director of New Harvest soon, like any minute now. And meanwhile, I told Jason, like, I'm gonna get this TEDx talk soon, but I had neither of them, and neither of them were confirmed. And what ended up happening is I did the TEDx presentation. It went super well, and then Jason invited me for an interview in DC, and so I flew down to see him. And the TEDx talk went up the morning of my interview. So
Wow.
when I went to
What
go
an unfair advantage.
yeah, I know. When I went to see Jason, he's like, I saw your talk this morning. And I was like, wow, I kind of lied. And I hadn't really, that's a new story, Paul, exclusive to Business for Good podcast.
Very good. Very good. The wires are lighting up right now. That's awesome, but it worked. You went out on a limb, and fortunately for you, it worked. And
Yeah.
the worst thing that could have happened from it would be that it could unfairly influence that. It's not like you were, out there telling anybody that your your testing for cancer tests worked when it didn't actually work. So, you know,
Right. Yes, I
yeah.
was putting my intention out into the world, and it came back, and I'm glad it did.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, now there is a lot of movement in this space. Like when you
Hmm.
became the executive director of New Harvest, it really was the realm of nonprofits or
Hmm.
academics. There really wasn't like a side that was trying to commercialize any products yet. And now you've had this explosion of companies. There's dozens and dozens of these startups, ranging from ones like Memphis Meats that have raised like over $150 million to some smaller
Hmm.
ones that are getting seed funding now. Um,
Hmm.
but but how do you see the role of a nonprofit organization like New Harvest now compared to when it was like the only game in town, essentially? Like, what is the
Hmm.
role that you see? Is it supporting these startups, advancing academic research? Like, what's the most important things that you think that New Harvest can do in today's world?
Hmm. That's a great question. So I think the role of a nonprofit is always to advance stuff that is not being advanced in any other way. So, like, what is the most neglected thing holding stuff back? That's what nonprofits should do. And so, in the very, very early days when New Harvest was the only game in town, I think the biggest challenge was there was so much to do that picking what to do first was the biggest,
Hmm.
was hard. And um, the kind of force factor for what we did do first, which was essentially convene a community, was that we had no money and that was the easiest thing to do. So, essentially set up a Facebook group and talk to every single person who's excited about growing meat from cells. And it turns out there's quite a lot of people around the world who thought that that was their own original idea and then Googled it and found out that New Harvest existed. So I met, hundreds of people the very first year I was with New Harvest who were all super excited about this idea, very activated, looking for opportunities to make this opportunity into something real. And um, just becoming that first central hub, I think, was the most important piece. And then the second important piece for me was making sure that real physical advancements happened in the world. I never wanted New Harvest to be just kind of messaging or advocacy. I wanted to make sure we were standing behind real scientific advancements, which probably speaks to me coming from a science background too. So the way that we made advancements in the lab was through these existing accelerator programs because it was kind of the only access to capital we had to do that kind of work. And that, of course, led to Perfect Day and Clara Foods. I could tell those stories like more with more detail later. But today, now that the field's kind of broadened, there's a lot more companies. There's some accelerators doing great work in this space. Now I feel like New Harvest can double down on what we do best and what continues to be the most neglected, which is um, bolstering our scientific foundation, building the field of cellular agriculture. This goes back to the idea of, when these companies exist, who are the people they're going to hire? Who are the technical experts that they are going to need, not only on their team pushing these advancements forward in the lab, but also independently as key opinion leaders that regulators would go to for public opinions and so on, and people who are kind of driving forward research that is, maybe 5 to 10 years out from being relevant to companies, but will become relevant down the line. Um,
Hmm.
we talk about companies as being these innovative powerhouses all the time, but oftentimes they're kind of putting together a lot of stuff that was actually discovered in a public academic setting or through military research or government grants. And so there is currently no driving force for that type of discovery research. And so New Harvest is filling that gap right now with the goal of kind of building the foundation of research in terms of kind of citations, papers, literature, and then B, building the scientific community, the actual people and experts who are going to become, the technical co-founders and technical hires, CTOs, et cetera, of the future. And by growing those two metrics, we believe that we will also create the backbone for government grants so that we can start applying for these huge $50 million kinds of grants that the government issues for
Mhm.
basically establishing new fields, bringing rock star researchers into the fold, building institutions around the world. And we can't do that without, the data and scientific community on the back end. So that's what New Harvest is focused on today. And it's a big thing to work on. But
Mhm.
I think we can do that. I think that's the one thing that we can do better than anybody else, and that we're really driving forward right now.
That's great. That's great, Isha. And I know that many of the names of people who are now working or even founders of some of the startups in the space really came out of New Harvest. Like, even though New
Hmm.
Harvest itself is not necessarily an incubator,
Hmm.
you look at like Marie Gibbons, who was a researcher for New Harvest and now works
Hmm.
at Memphis Meats, or even
Hmm.
Uma Valetti, the co-founder of Memphis Meats, who was on the New Harvest board of directors, or
Hmm.
Jess Krieger, who's now a co-founder of Artemis Foods. Like, the list goes on and on of people
Yep.
who have been a part of the New Harvest team and now are either starting or working at some of these companies in the space. So it certainly speaks to the importance of what you're doing. Now,
Hmm.
you know, I want to ask you about one of the most controversial topics in the field.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so brace yourself.
Yep.
So first I just want to give credit where credit is due, because you've been using the term cellular agriculture during this conversation, which is a term that you invented, and it's a great term. It really,
Thank you.
I think it does a wonderful job of explaining, what
Hmm.
is happening. There's another a second agricultural revolution, so to speak, where we're not domesticating animals or plants, but we're domesticating their cells, and that's the cellular agriculture revolution. Now,
Hmm.
when this all got started, you mentioned that people would search for in vitro meat, which of course did not whet many appetites. So
Yes.
then there was a shift to people wanting to call it cultured meat because it sounded much better, admittedly, than in vitro meat. And then there were some concerns that cultured meat wasn't as consumer friendly. That both New Harvest and the Good Food Institute did some research on it and found that cultured meat posed some questions or concerns. And so then people were switching to clean meat. But then there were concerns that it was too offensive to the meat industry to call it clean meat, and other concerns were raised. And so then some folks wanted to call it cell based meat. And then some folks were concerned about that because it sounds extremely consumer unfriendly. Very few people want to eat cells. And there's also the concern that um, all meat is cell based, of course. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit difficult to actually distinguish it, or to think that the government would allow it when it doesn't really distinguish it at all. So now you got groups like Good Food Institute who are saying, well, let's call it cultivated meat,
Hmm.
saying that kind of splits the baby, so to speak. And sorry, I know that your baby Marcel turns one this week, so I don't mean to use a violent analogy here, but it is kind of splitting the baby. Say cultivated meat. So first and foremost, you notice this: cultured, cell-based, cultivated, clean. Nobody can think of anything that starts with something other than a C, first of all.
Yeah.
So I don't know why
Yeah.
there's no imagination beyond these C words. But you've been using cultured, and tell me why. Like, why is that your pick of the word to use?
That's a great question. So this whole conversation reminds me of something I saw on Twitter, which is, it's not particularly interesting to talk about Twitter, but it was a tweet that said, "What's the most petty hill that you will die on?" And someone wrote, the the most petty hill I would die on is, I don't care if the toilet paper uh, rolls from the inside or the outside. I don't care at all. And that's actually my position on this. Is I don't care what the name of it is. I call it cultured meat probably just because out of habit, and I started calling it cultured meat. I don't see it as particularly terrible. Like in vitro, I probably did use in vitro way back, but then that kind of went out the window, and so I kind of use it out of muscle memory. But to some degree, I mean, we are a research institute, and academic freedom is a important thing to us. So we don't tell our researchers, to all convene behind a term, because their independence is really crucial and important. I think that there are probably terms that need to be picked for different audiences. There's when you're talking to a certain group, you want to use a certain term because that's going to kind of bring them on board faster or make them think in a different way or whatever. And so, I'd like to think that I have the freedom to do whatever is best for the space. You know, I have that flexibility, and I think everybody should have that flexibility too. And I also don't really think that it's up to me to decide what the right term is, because my audience, the audiences that we deal with on a daily basis, might not be the audiences that a company deals with on a daily basis. So I don't think I'm in the position to tell anybody what terms they should use. So
Okay.
essentially, I use cultured because of muscle memory, because I think it's accurate enough. I think it's also appetizing enough. Like there's some familiarity with it. I personally think cultured and cultivated are so similar that we should have just gone back to cultured instead of creating another term. Because I mean, cultivated is, there already are, like, that is already an agriculture term. It's something that probably touches on big ag more than cultured. At least cultured is already kind of food tech, and that it alludes to some kind of fermentation or something like that. Whereas cultivated is, I mean, to me, cultivated would make a great plant-based term because
Hmm.
plants are cultivated. So anyway,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna pick everything apart because it's like both
Yeah.
very easy to, it's easy to pick things apart and it's hard to stand behind something. And yeah,
Right.
I think people are gonna name whatever they need to name, and I hope when the branded products come out that they also don't feel limited and they can kind of brand appropriately. I mean, think about Soylent. I mean, that's probably the worst name theoretically to go forward with, but you're heading for a certain audience with it. And so we probably want to keep our options open because there could be many different audiences for cultured meat down the line.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you make some very good points. I too share your thought about cultured and cultivated being very similar to one another. And, in terms of petty hills to die on, I think, I think a petty hill I might die on is like the use of the Oxford comma. That seems like to me my hill that I would die on, maybe, or um, or maybe the misuse of the word literally. Like it always bothers me when people use literally to mean metaphorically. They'll
Yes.
be like, "Oh,
Yeah.
it's so funny! I literally died." I'm like, "Wow, it's amazing." But but yeah, I mean, I think from my own perspective on it. First, we can just call it
Mhm.
CM. CM, whatever you think the C stands for, just call it CM. But
Yeah.
the only thing I really object to, I think, is cell based
Mhm.
meat, just because I think it's so unappetizing. Yeah, there's the question, or not the question, but the problem that all meat is cell based, but it just sounds so unappetizing because nobody wants to eat cells,
Mhm.
despite the fact that, of course, we eat cells all the time, but nobody wants to eat it. And so for me, like I'm content using cultured or cultivated. I also think queen is fine, not just because that's the name of my book, Queen Meat, but also I think it actually is a good reference to queen energy. And so I realize why people wouldn't use it for concerns about offending the meat industry,
Right.
especially if your investors are the meat industry. Like I'm
Yeah.
totally I
I
do
mean,
the same thing in those shoes. But I know that it's not a scientific term. It's not what the government's going to call it. And so,
right.
like for me, like cultured, I'm fine with. Queen, cultivated, I don't really care that much. I just think it should be consumer friendly and accurate. And my
Right.
concern about cell based is that it's neither of those.
Well,
But
I mean,
it's not my decision to make, of course, but it is my opinion.
well, I mean, New Harvest primary audience is, how do we grow the scientific community? How do we build credibility and buy-in from the scientific community? And so, clean is not going to do that because it's attributing qualities that we
Sure.
don't know exist.
Yeah.
Cultured might,
Right.
but from also a publication standpoint, it's going to be hard to do research when there's so many publications out there with so many different names, and how do you search for the full
Yeah.
portfolio?
Right.
So that's like a little bit of a thing. But the clean is funny
Yeah.
because I was initially had such an allergic reaction to clean, but since COVID happened, I'm like,
Hmm.
clean's actually really good right now. This is like, the idea, before we wanted stuff to be, organic and, natural and friendly, but more than ever, we're looking for, like, how do I get the cleaning wipes with the most bleach in it and like the most, um, science powered cleanliness behind it. And so in a way, clean might be like actually really great for the times, and kind of seeing what's happening in all these meat processing plants too. But anyway, again, I wouldn't use that with our kind of science base. I just think it's always just an interesting conversation to keep going. I'm kind of confused that cellular
Yeah.
agriculture, no one asked any questions about it, and it just kind of took off with not much anything behind it.
Mhm. Yeah, I think a cellular agriculture is a great term to describe the field,
Mhm,
and I think that the issue about what you call the meat is maybe more important because it's what
mhm,
consumers are going to hear.
mhm,
Like when people hear plant-based meat, like that's what they hear. Do you want to eat plant-based meat? Well, people like plants, so they think of plants as being good for them. So the question for me is whether people will think cells are something that they want to eat or not. But anyway, I don't want to beat a dead microbe for too long on that. But
mhm.
I will say this about it: in the field, I have also thought from a terminology perspective that, of course, scientifically, if people are talking about bioreactors, that's fine. But I've always been concerned publicly about talking about it, and I've proposed calling them cultivators because I
Mm,
think it sounds a lot consumer friendlier. So you're growing
mhm,
meat in cultivators. It's like, you know, I don't know how many people have their appetites wet when they think about their food coming out of a bioreactor.
mhm.
So I like the term cultivator for whatever it's worth. For a long time, I've
Well,
recommended cultivators. So
I I
yeah, hit
think
me. Tell me if
maybe
you think that's wrong.
no, I don't think it's wrong. I mean, I think it's technically right, and you can call it whatever you want. But I think that I think there is an interesting opinion when it comes to thinking about consumers because I think, for me, a big way that we're going to bypass what happened to GMOs is being as frank and open about what we're doing when we talk about growing meat from cells and culture this and so, whatever. I think it has to be pretty on the surface what we're doing, and achieving understanding should actually be the goal, because making kind of bringing people on board with the mission of growing meat from cells, why we're doing it, why the people, why the scientists in the lab are motivated by this, and so on, is going to be really, really crucial down the line to prevent people from just having
Mm,
this enormous allergic reaction to this secret thing
yeah.
that's been shoved in our food all this year. I mean, I'm amazed how many people
Right. Yeah.
tell me, haven't I already been eating that at Taco Bell or McDonald's or whatever? And I'm like, no, but I mean, that would be
Yeah.
cool, but no, that's not happening right now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I wish.
yeah. Um,
I wish. Yeah.
so,
That's like when people make up like urban legends, like, oh, like,
right,
McDonald's burgers, they're not even beef. It's like I wish that was true. That'd be awesome. But alas,
right,
it is not. But yeah, no, I
right.
mean, to be clear, I'm not recommending trying to keep anybody in the dark. I just think the name cultivator is
No,
a good name for it. But
yeah, no,
let me ask
I
you,
agree. Sorry.
yeah, and
I
I
just
also
have
want to
one
I
more
also want to
thing.
say, oh no, go on. Sorry, you first, you first.
Well, the one more thing is, I saw a publication recently that Mark Post put out around consumer acceptance. And normally I'm like the consumer acceptance publications, and I don't, whatever, it doesn't matter because we can't really predict what's going to happen with these products. I have the green eggs and ham approach. I will not eat green egg, and then you taste it and you're like, okay, I'm into it. But the conclusion of it was people were more likely to want cultured meat and taste it and be happy with it and pay more for it and so on if they had heard of it before. And so all this work that we're doing upstream of products being on the market, just the discourse, even if it's not 100% positive, I think contributes to the success of products down the line, because we're just being transparent. We're just telling the stories of the people working on this stuff, and that all matters. Like, it's just honest
Yeah,
messaging. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's it. I think you're making a really important and excellent point, and um, for me, that does speak to the importance of getting this discussion out there for people to hear about it. But I've always said, like, if you think about the three biggest barriers to widespread commercialization and acceptance, people always talk about government regulations, technological hurdles, and consumer acceptance. And,
Hmm.
and I've always thought of consumer acceptance as the least of those hurdles. Like, I always think if this is
Hmm.
approved for consumption and it tastes good and it's affordable, many people will eat it. And I'm not saying everybody will, but many people will eat
Hmm.
it. And
Hmm.
I agree that the more they know about it, the more familiar it will be, and the more they will. But in terms of government regulations, rather than talking about the regulations, you mentioned earlier about, like, for example, a $50 million um, funding of this. Like, out of
Mm.
curiosity, think about all government funding globally for the cultured meat research in all of history combined. Do you think it totals $50 million? I
Mm.
don't think so. Yeah, I don't think
Yeah, I
so. I
don't
mean,
I don't think
I
so,
mean, it might be less than 10 million as far as I can recall.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know fully what Israel and Singapore might total to, but
yeah,
I
yeah,
yeah,
good point.
I think you're right.
Right.
It's
And
not
so,
enough.
yeah, and that just underscores, I think, one of the important aspects of what New Harvest is doing, and that could, is such an important goal.
Mhm.
So let me ask you then also, Isha, like, in terms of like like lobbying the government to, let's say, like, whether it's the National Science Foundation or maybe USDA Agricultural Research Services, and or et cetera, like, what do you see as the role for nonprofits like New Harvest in lobbying? Like, is it solely related to research funding? Do you all get involved in any of the battles over who is going to regulate this or what the labeling of it ought to be? Is that part of New Harvest mission, or really the agenda?
Not at all. We do not do any lobbying whatsoever. And so I would say that our relationship with the government, if any, is like we are the credible public academic resource organization. If the government's like, where do I find an expert in cellular agriculture, they can come to us and they can know that we know, this broad network of scientists who don't have conflicts of interest and who can speak to the science behind cellular agriculture, but we ourselves are not lobbying for anything in particular. I think it may sound like lobbying when I say that we are supporting research so that we can apply for these bigger government grants, but really that's not what's happening because New Harvest is not applying for those grants. When you apply for a big government grant, you usually have to like cite a whole bunch of literature in your application, and so
Mhm.
in the absence of any cellular agriculture literature, it's really hard for someone whose whole career has been focused on biomedical engineering to suddenly be proposing that they want to grow food and for all these reasons and for so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do is use the research that we support as catalytic research that becomes these very important citations for government grants, but those grants are ultimately driven by rock star scientists in our network, not by New Harvest. So it is still
Mm.
us creating resources, creating important citations, but not it's not really lobbying activity. It's just kind of
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I want to get back to a couple controversial points also, then, Isha. So,
Mhm.
first, let me ask you,
Mhm.
which do you think will be commercialized first? Uh, Leather grown from animal cells or from collagen or et cetera, or meat?
um, Definitely leather.
That's definitely leather. Okay, because Modern Meadow has been around. What year were they founded? Was it? It feels like it was
I think
maybe 2012. Was
2011.
my record?
I think
2011.
2011.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I know that Andras, their CEO and founder, is on your board of directors now at New Harvest. So you might have
Mhm.
insider information. So you might have some insider intel here. But share with us, why do you think leather is going to be commercialized before meat?
I mean, I think for the same reason that Modern Meadow has been around since 2011, it means they've just been working on it longer. I mean, I think from a technical standpoint, there, there's a lot more flexibility in how leather can be defined, and therefore a lot more options in terms of how you would approach the science behind producing leather in culture. Um, there isn't a big regulatory situation to deal with. Um, I think the materials industry is already very primed to receive a lot of innovation, so it wouldn't seem like a disruption in the same
Mm,
way that maybe cultured meat would for the existing meat industry. And you can sell a watch strap for $100, but you can't sell like a pepperoni stick for $100. And so the the entry for that first product is a lot lower. I
Mhm.
mean, similarly, I
Okay,
don't actually.
so let me ask you.
Mhm.
No, go ahead. No, you don't actually.
Well, I mean, we saw these, on the acellular agriculture side, growing proteins from cultures. We saw, the silk proteins come out first, bolt threads, tie, fibers, jacket before
Mhm.
perfect days, milk or Clara's eggs or stuff like that. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I mean, and then also, I need to fact check myself on this, but I'm pretty sure GMO cotton, I mean, that can come out and enter the market before the foods. I think it came out first, but I have to check my sources on that one.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. So let me then ask you the multi-million dollar question
Mm.
here. When do you think cultured meat will first be sold somewhere in the world? Now, I don't mean on grocery store shelves, but I mean a sale, even if it's a one time at a restaurant sale for publicity purposes. But when will be the first sale of cultured meat somewhere on earth that you predict?
Well, I think if the sale could be publicity, it could happen tomorrow if one of the companies wanted that. Um,
Mhm.
so I don't so I don't think that maybe
Well,
expanding the
I don't think there's a
platform.
government that's approved it, though. I don't think there's a government that's approved it. I think it would be illegal to do that, is my understanding.
Well, I'm sure you could sign a waiver. Don't you think? I
Maybe, I
mean,
don't know.
we tasted that cultured meat. I mean, a few years ago.
Yeah, yeah,
Couldn't we have on
yeah. We ate it.
paper
I mean,
like given someone $5 to do that? I mean, this is now
I think
legal.
we could have been. I think we could. I just don't know whether it would be legal. I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate during the period of writing the book Queen Meat that I got to eat, so many of the products from these companies, from fish to pork to beef to foie gras and to duck meat and so on. And so I felt like I really got to try a whole bunch of different things.
Yes.
But my understanding of it, which may be limited, is that you can give anybody free food, but if you actually want to make a commercial sale of a product, that there needs to be some type of regulation, and you have to have a license to be a food seller, and
Okay.
so on. And so that's what I think. I mean, I don't think the government just lets you sell food if you're not licensed, but I don't know.
Yeah,
But anyway,
I don't I don't know either. I
yeah,
shouldn't be picking apart your
yeah.
question, but the problem is I think that $1,000,000 question kind of needs to be picked
Hmm.
apart because there's such a vast range in terms of what we're talking about when we say a cultured meat product.
Yes.
And I think whatever cultured meat product comes to market first is going to be something that's like the most technically achievable, obviously. And so I think, if it were up entirely up to me, I would say the first cultured meat product is probably something like animal cells sprinkled on a veggie burger, or animal proteins sprinkled on a veggie burger that were grown outside of an animal, but it's just the proteins and not the cells. And so
Hmm.
those.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's kind of like the whole premise behind what companies like Mission Barns are doing.
Mhm,
With Aton Fisher and his group at Mission
mhm,
Barns are doing, is basically growing animal fat, which they assert is much easier to grow than animal muscle, and then they would sell it
mhm.
as an ingredient to companies like what you were just referring
Yeah.
to, so that you could have you know a plant based burger that has more realistic animal fat in it, so to
Mhm.
speak. Um,
Yeah. And I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that
that would be
that
pretty cool.
kind of product is I mean, not only more technically achievable, but probably has a more straightforward regulatory pathway too. And so that type of
Mhm.
product, I could probably envision within the next 5 years. But the product that I think we're
Cool.
all thinking about, which is, a fully, textured steak or something, that's a ways away.
Mhm.
And I think New Harvest's research portfolio is probably going to contribute to that because it's going to require a lot of inputs from a lot of different places. In my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that, the thought of having Costco grocery store shelves, having cultured meat on those shelves is many years off, sadly.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I did try actually a product like what you're describing at Mission Barns, where they served some plant based meat where they had put their duck fat that they grew into it,
Cool.
and it was quite delicious. But it wasn't. It wasn't back to back. Like I didn't try like one that had coconut oil
Mm,
in it or something that was plant based. So
mm,
I'd like to do that in the future. But I can tell you it
right.
was quite delectable. It tastes fantastic. Um, so, what do you think is are like white spaces in the area? Few people have as much of a bird's eye view, so to speak, of view of the field. So, knowing what you know about which companies exist now and what research is currently happening, like what's the biggest white space that you think needs to be filled in the cellular ag space?
I've been excited about the past year or so because I feel like we're seeing more companies emerge that are in the picks and shovels category. So people working on certain aspects of the cultured meat supply chain, as opposed to being these kind of vertically integrated companies that do everything required to deliver meat, cultured meat to your plate. So these are companies working on
Hmm.
serum-free media, companies working on enabling technologies in bioreactor design. There's a company I recently met that's like, we only grow like a lot of myotubes, and then we're going to sell those myotubes, which is exciting. And so I can't even tell you that I know all of these new companies because I was, we were going to have our New Harvest 2020 conference this year, and I wanted to onboard a whole bunch of early stage companies into the conference, and I onboarded before COVID hit. I onboarded 10 companies that were all founded in 2019, and they were all working kind of like different
Hmm.
aspects of the supply chain. And a lot of them I had never met before, never heard of. So it's kind of hard for me to address the white spaces because they're getting filled in pretty quickly. Um, but I
No,
would
that's good
say
news.
that I think that there are some interesting questions that could be asked, such as, we're going. These all relates to, instead of this back-to-back comparison of meat as we know it today and the meat that could exist with cultured meat, that opens some questions. One of them is what what species of cell actually is the fastest and most cost effective to grow? Maybe it is not beef, pork, chicken, turkey, duck, and maybe it's something else that we just don't know of. That's an interesting question and could lead to a really cool business idea. And I would be surprised if no one has thought of that. um, and then relatedly,
It could be like it could be like the turducken of cell ag, where you have like turkey cells, duck cells, and chicken cells, and you can weave them all together. You familiar? Well, wait, let me ask you: are you familiar with with the turducken? Do you know what that is?
oh yes, I'm very familiar with
Um,
it.
okay, all
That's
right.
like the
For
original
listeners who don't know, there's
information.
there's an actual product called the turducken, which is a chicken stuffed inside of a duck, stuffed inside of a turkey, and then you cook it all together, and then you eat the three birds together. And so maybe the best blend is some type of like combo like that. So who knows what it'll be? But
Yeah.
it's funny, Isha. I've asked Jason Matheny for the last like 15 years when he thinks that the products like these will be on the market. And he has a really funny joke where he says, no matter what year he is asked, it'll always be 5 years out. It's 5 years
Yeah.
out. So
Yeah.
when I asked him in 2005, it was 5 years out. And I asked him in 2010, same thing. And I think he would still say the same today. I'll have to ask him. But yeah, that's, I think that there are some people who are very optimistic and hopeful, but I
Yeah.
think there's others who I think are a bit more realistic about what to expect in the coming years, which is one reason I think that plant-based and blending of plant-based into animal
Hmm.
proteins is so important because,
Hmm.
people are like, well, when cultured meat hits the market, isn't it just going to obviate all of this? And it's like, well, not only is that not true when it does hit the market, but it's going to take decades to scale up.
Yep. Yep.
Like, I mean, even if it was on store shelves today, the infrastructure needed to scale it up to totally displace all animal agriculture today. I mean, it's so fanciful in terms of like the idea that it's going to just rapidly change in a period of a few years.
Yeah, totally.
So
And that's why I almost have like think we shouldn't even talk about this as disruption, because it's much more of an evolution than a revolution to use
yeah,
a
yeah.
statement like that. And I also, I mean, it reminds me a lot of driverless cars or whatever you want to
Mm,
call it, where people are envisioning this, what that product is, as the fully tricked out thing that you can like read a newspaper in while you're being driven all over the city, when actually the driverless cars that we're going to see first are cars that like parallel park for you. And
yeah.
we should be having that level, those types of levels for cultured meat too. We should be thinking of it that way.
That's a really great analogy. I really, really like that a lot. Yeah, and in some ways, I mean, cruise control is a driverless car in some respects,
Hmm.
also. So,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
so let me ask you, Isha. You've done a lot in your life, and there are many people who I think would look at you and say, "Wow, how can I be more like her?" So, tell us, are there any resources that you have found useful in your own journey in your life that you would recommend to others, whether they be books or maybe somebody else's speeches, maybe even your own speeches, but anything that you would recommend for others who want to try to pave a path that might be somewhat similarly impressive to yours?
Yeah, there's one that comes to mind, and um, I'll preface this with a little bit of talking up front, which is around my philosophy around the idea that we will have cultured meat on store shelves is inspired by Carl Sagan, who has a quote where he says, "If you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first create the universe." And I tell this quote to most people that I have a first conversation with, because in many ways, this has been my personal philosophy of how to make cultured meat exist. It's not by multiplying cells in the lab, it's actually by creating the universe that will create cultured meat. So making sure that there are scientists, entrepreneurs, regulatory people, independent researchers, investors, philanthropists, etc. All these people have to exist and have to have the adequate resources in order for cultured meat to not only come about technically, but go through regulation, end up on store shelves, be marketed in cool ways, be tasty, etc. And this ecosystem approach has guided a lot of decisions in my life. An example of that is, stepping away from Perfect Day and Clara Foods as a co-founder so that they could kind of grow on their own. New Harvest has founding equity in them now instead of me personally. And so I could focus on kind of building out the rest of the ecosystem. I think a lot of companies that have come through New Harvest have come from this very generous approach of like, anyone who comes through New Harvest and goes on to contribute to CellAg as a field is helping everybody else. Like the more people exist in the field, the better chance we have. And I think a book that bolstered that sentiment, or at least created more narrative around it that I could wrap my head around and also tell people about, was a book called The Generosity Network by Jennifer McCrae. She
Okay.
is a expert fundraiser, and so she does these really awesome fundraising workshops and courses, which can seem really expensive but are worth every penny. Like, I've done her workshop twice. I was going to say maybe three times, twice at least. And the Generosity Network is just about essentially how to ask for money, how you think of everybody in your field and everybody behind your mission as having something to contribute, whether it is time or money or expertise or whatever. And after reading that book, I felt just so differently about New Harvest and what we do, because I realized that contributing value to the space, it was not about transaction. It was about how much can we put into this pool to grow CellAg collectively. And I would recommend it as reading if you're raising funds for a company or a nonprofit, or if you're not raising funds at all. It's just a great example of how you get people into your mission and bring them on board.
Fantastic. Well, we'll certainly include a link to that book in the show notes. It's a great suggestion. And I have not read it nor even heard of it. So shame on me, but I'm going to put it on my own list, Isha. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate everything that you have done and accomplished to help advance the field of cellular agriculture, including naming it. And can assure you that I will be rooting for your and New Harvest's continued success. And we'll look forward to that day when you're able to effectuate a $50 million governmental grant and quintuple the amount of global governmental research going into cellular agriculture in all of history. So, and when that time comes, we'll do a proper accounting to make sure it's a quintupling. But But thank you very much for everything you're doing, Isha. And it's great to get to talk with you here. And again, we'll be rooting for your success.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's great to be on your show. And I have to thank you also for so much that you've done for New Harvest. I have to say the book Clean Meat was such an important milestone for the space and continues to be a great traffic director in New Harvest direction. So thank you so much also for what you've done for us.
Little would make me happier than the book driving people your way. So thank you for that. Thanks for listening. We hope you found use in this episode. If so, don't keep it to yourself. Please leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. And as always, we hope you will be in the business of doing good.